So Andrew Yang went on David Pakman's show, and David Pakman interviewed him. I think they talked about his book, and they talked about his new Forward Party. And here's a moment that I wanted to show you guys, because I do think it fundamentally misses the point. And it's prescribing a solution which Yang believes is a sincere solution. And let me be clear, this isn't, what he's proposing is not like it's a bad thing. Like, the problem he's discussing, it's like it's not a problem. But I think that he sort of misses the overarching issue. So let's take a look and then we'll discuss.
Completely agree with you that the system, by explicitly and implicitly, with things like the term limits that we have, almost always having to be campaigning for your next election, all these different things don't prioritize solutions to long-term problems like climate change. I agree with everything you said. And yet, part of climate change is a huge portion of one side doesn't believe it's real, or if they do, they don't believe humans are a factor. So this is where I get to, your analysis is great. I don't think it accounts for, it's more than that. When one side simply won't accept the science, how do you get those people to buy in?
All right, so let's play this out.
Yeah.
What proportion of Americans don't believe that climate change is real or caused by humans?
The last I've seen, it's, I wish I had the data in front of me. I think it's about half or 60% of Republicans don't believe it's caused by humans, and maybe 25, 33%, something like that, don't believe it's even happening at all.
Yeah, so that lines up with what I thought the numbers were roughly. So let's imagine that you have gross numbers, 35% of Americans who either don't think climate change is caused by humans or it's not a big deal or whatever it is. And that percentage is declining happily or unhappily because it's becoming so apparent around us.
Yeah. So
right now you have a Republican Party that is motivated by that, let's call it, for argument's sake, roughly half of the Republican Party or a bit more does not think climate change is something we should do anything about.
Sure.
The problem is that relative minority ends up controlling the agenda for half of the country and then can stall any real move to change it.
Yes.
So let's say hypothetically, instead of having two parties, we had four parties or five parties. And you had progressive Democrats, moderate Democrats, forwardists, moderate Republicans, and conservative Republicans. And the conservative Republicans would be like, hey, climate change, bunk, let's not do a thing. But then you'd have the four other groups look up and say, we should do something about it. So what you're seeing here is not quite minority rule, but it's minority veto, or it's minority keeping anything from happening. And so this is the system as it currently is made up. So the thing that I want people to come to grips with is that politics right now is completely tribal. And you can be very, very angry at what another tribe says or feels. But the problem right now is that we only have two tribes, and it doesn't take much to gum up the works, which is why we're all losing our minds, getting more polarized and frustrated.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to come back to the tribalism point in a second, but to his multi-party idea. Listen, I'm not against that. In fact, if I was starting a system from scratch in the U.S., number one, I would abolish the Senate. It's where most decent legislation goes to die. And it's really not representative. It's not small d democratic. And, you have like Wyoming has the same number of senators as California. Wyoming has 8 people and California has 12 quadrillion. It's like, now I get why the founders did it, but I just don't agree with the system. I think it's a little ridiculous and it's undemocratic. And the other thing that's funny to me is it's like, for some reason, I don't know why, a lot of people pretend like it's not undemocratic. And it's like, okay, you can support the system, but just acknowledge the fact that it's undemocratic, because it is a fact that it's undemocratic. Okay. So I'm not against what he's saying. If I was starting from scratch, I would abolish the Senate. I would have more of a parliamentary style system. I definitely have ranked choice voting. I definitely have open primaries. I definitely have a lot more direct democracy as well, like direct votes from the people on issues. So he's not wrong when he brings up like, hey, this is a better way to do it. In fact, I think he's sort of right about that. But it does fundamentally miss the way politics works. Because even if we set up the system he's describing, you still wouldn't get action on climate change. You still wouldn't get it. Why? How? How do I know that? Because the reason we don't have action on climate change is simply because of the influence of the oil lobby and the dirty energy lobby. They have bought virtually the entire Republican Party and some of the Democrats, and that's enough to totally stall any real movement towards renewable energy and green technology and getting off of fossil fuels. So the real problem is moneyed interests buying the political system. That's the real problem. So the real problem is corruption, money in politics, legalized bribery. Now, the way you address that is this thing called clean elections. The way you address that is to publicly finance elections, don't have any private money in the system. Now, it's hard to get to that point because the Supreme Court basically ruled that it's a right to have private money in our elections because they say money equals free speech. I think that's ludicrous, but that's what they say. So you'd either need a constitutional amendment to address that, or there's only one workaround that I could think of, which is direct ballot initiatives at the federal level, which is direct democracy at the federal level. And in theory, you could have the American people vote on 3 or 5 top issues every 4 years when we go vote for president. That's a way to work around the corruption where it almost doesn't even matter that they're corrupt if we get the final say on the most important issues every 4 years or so. It's not a perfect solution, but it's something that's a hell of a lot better than what we do right now, without a doubt. And the reason why, it's clear to see why he's incorrect. Take gun control, for example. Something like 90% of Americans want universal background checks, and we still haven't gotten a universal background check bill passed. Now, if you switch it up into a 4 or 5, 6, 7 party system, doesn't matter, you're still not going to get it passed. Because again, the issue is the money in the system. The issue is, at least on the Republican side, all the Republicans are bought by the gun lobby, and maybe a handful of the Democrats are bought by them too. And so all change is blocked on that front. It's interesting. You'll notice the only areas where we see any real movement in Congress are social issues, where there's not as much money flooding the system. So, there's more movement in the correct direction when it's like gay rights, for example. The Supreme Court was the one who ultimately said, gays have a right to get married. But historically, you do see more movement on social issues because there's not as much money flooding the system against it. Like, the Christian right lobby doesn't have nearly as much money as everybody else in the country. And corporations are also now sort of on board with a more socially open-minded and progressive approach. So that's why you see movement on those issues. But where they want to grind stuff to a halt, they do. And so my point to Andrew Yang here is multi-party system's great. Fine, I'm on board with that. I think that's a wonderful idea. But it's just not going to solve the problems that we're talking about. And they were talking about climate change. Why don't we have action on climate change? It doesn't matter if 90% of the American people wanted action on climate change. The problem is the money in the system. It's not anything else, really. But now let's go through a few more things here. He's been bringing up term limits a lot as some sort of solution. That's another area where it's I'm actually torn on term limits. They're also literally undemocratic because in theory you could have somebody you want to keep reelecting because they do an awesome job. Bernie Sanders is a great example of that. The presidency has term limits. And it's does that make the presidents better? No, it's not because there's term limits, they go in for their short amount of time and then they do a good job and then they leave. So it's not necessarily a solution. There are upsides to it, but I just don't think that there's some cure-all or even necessarily a good thing in all instances. So I'm not sure term limits is a real solution. The other thing he loves is UBI. He didn't bring it up there. I agree with him on that. I agree with him on ranked choice voting and open primaries. But final point is on the tribalism thing. He's oh, we're so tribal, we're more tribal than ever. Well, yes and no. The culture war has made it so we are, in a sense, more tribal and partisan than ever before. And people are more at each other's throats. And social media has exacerbated that, where it's almost like the squeaky wheel gets the grease and everybody who's fighting is where all the attention goes. And so in some ways we are more tribal than ever before. But I submit to you, that is just on the culture war shit. And the culture war is largely a distraction from the economic war that's going on, that the elites are waging on, the 1% are waging on the 99%. And, foreign policy and things of that nature. These are the things that matter. And on that stuff, there's a lot of agreement, which is why every time you looked at a poll for the Build Back Better stuff on each specific policy, they're really popular. It's why people want a living wage and people want Medicare for all and, people want paid time off. And so there's actually, in some ways, we're less polarized than ever before. On the actual substantive issues, we're less polarized. It's just on all the cultural stuff, there's a vehement divide. So I always want to, whenever people make that tribalism point and the partisanship point, it's yeah, it's half true, but look at the other piece of the picture, because that's just as important. And what actually brings us together is probably more than what splits us apart, but nobody reminds people of that. Nobody tells you that. You know, like there's probably some libertarian guy or some right-winger who's watching this who's agreeing with a lot of the shit I'm saying. And it's like, well, yeah, because we've been fed this bullshit narrative, both from the media and the sense we get on social media, that like, well, we always hate each other and it's always been like that and that's the end of the conversation. It's like, no, in some areas we are going to disagree and we'll vehemently disagree. And that's fine. And that's the tribalism and that's the partisanship. But there's a lot more agreement than people think there is. The real fault lines in the country, it's the corporations and the billionaires in the top 1% versus the 99%. And it's the people versus the elites. So it's like all of the owned politicians in Washington, D.C., totally corrupt. It's them versus the people. These are the real lines. That's not to like gloss over the real cultural and social issues differences we have. They matter, but I don't like it when people overhype that and act like there actually is no other agreement elsewhere when there's massive agreement on a lot of things. So anyway, that's my breakdown of it. Again, every time I cover this forward party thing, I tell you guys, the parts I like are simple. UBI, ranked choice voting, open primaries. I think it's commendable. If he's doing the DSA model, which half the time he says he's doing, great. That's great. But there are elements of it that I think might be either a little bit of an overreach or maybe a bit of a waste of time. Like the idea of half the time he says he's doing the DSA model. Great, that could work. And then the other half the time he's like, well, we're going to break the duopoly. And it's like, no, you're not. You're not going to get anybody elected who's just a forward party member, full stop. And let's be honest about that. But anyway, look, any real attempts to improve the system, and in some ways he's doing that, I commend him. But I would submit to him, for the love of God, you got to focus on the corruption part, because that's the elephant in the room, and a guy who's as smart as Andrew Yang should be able to realize that. But, you know, who knows if he will sort of make that one of his big issues, because I've had massive areas of colossal disagreement with Andrew before, too. All of his stuff on Israel's beyond salvageable. It's terrible. It's as bad as any Republican on that stuff or corporate Democrat. So anyway, there you have it.